welcome to the Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode 28 with Max Freakout and Cyber Disciple. I'd like to start by reading a quotation from a great mystic of ego death. My followers are taking something that is the epitome of simple and clear, and then they're applying their big brain analysis to it, and quickly, by the time they touch it, they leave it a smoking, complicated ruin and wreck that's all complicated and broken, and the opposite of what it is. Good. So with that beginning, I think we will venture on to a new attempt to make the ego death theory a smoking ruin and wreck. This episode is dedicated to Strangeloop, who indicated he would be interested in hearing us discuss the ego death theory in detail and trying to describe it in simple terms and its importance. And that made a lot of sense to us. We started this project first with our own biographies with this theory, and then use that to launch a critique of the popular narratives or common media narratives about psychedelics and what they're for and what they do. That's our kind of beginning suite of episodes back in 2016 and 2017. So we jumped into the deep end of the pool there and didn't necessarily describe in detail our own sense of this framework and theory that we use there to interpret other people's attempts to describe psychedelics and the altered state, so to speak, and transcendent knowledge. So I guess we should start with, Max, what is the ego death theory?
I think that the aim here is to make the simplest possible assertion about the ego death theory, which tries to encapsulate it as much as possible. And so on a really fundamental level, I think that what the ego death theory is saying is that the mind... Okay, so fundamentally, the absolute fundamental essence is that the mind models reality. And the focus, the subject matter of the ego death theory is precisely the model which the mind creates in order to model reality. I should say model the world. So you have a thing called a mental world model, and the ego death theory is a theory about mental world models or world modeling. And crucially, it's a dualist theory. The ego death theory asserts that there are two things. So two-ness is right at the core of the ego death theory. It's a comparison and a contrast between two different things. And there's all sorts of ways that you can characterize what those two things are. But I think first and foremost, it's two mental models of time and control agency. And that perfectly corresponds to two states of consciousness. So then it's just a case of filling in the details of what is the one mental model of time and control, and what is the corresponding state of consciousness that model of time and control fits with, and then what is the other mental model of time and control and the state of consciousness. So very simply, with the state in regard to states of consciousness, you have the ordinary state of consciousness, number one, and the psychedelic state of consciousness, number two. And Michael Hoffman has elucidated a theory of cognitive information processing which specifies that the ordinary state of consciousness is characterized as tight cognitive association binding, and then the psychedelic state of consciousness is loose cognitive association binding. So each of those two states of consciousness corresponds to a mental world model, but in particular, a mental model of time and agency. And so this is an important point here that I said on the fundamental level, the absolute most blunt, basic assertion is that the mind models the world. But when the mind models the world, there's a very important connection between the way that the mind models time and the way that the mind models control. You can't separate those two things. It's as if the mind models time and control at the same time. And so the mental model of time and the mental model of control are inextricably linked to each other. So then you have the ordinary state based model of time and control, which is possibilism. So possibilism meaning branching time. So the past does not branch, and we experience time this way in the ordinary state, that the timeline from the beginning of the universe or the beginning of my lifetime till the present moment only has one single course of events. So that's like saying I only remember one life. I don't have different possibilities of different lives that I could have lived. Up to the present moment, I've only got the one memory of life. But in the future, there's multiple different pathways according to the choices that I decide to make from the present moving into the future. So that's the ordinary state model of time and control. And then the crucial insight of the ego death theory is that when a person takes psychedelic drugs, or more aptly, you could call them cognitive looseners, so chemical substances which cause temporary cognitive loosening, a psychedelic trip, that during that window of time when the body is under the effect, the mind is under the effect of those chemicals like LSD and psilocybin, the mind switches to a different way of, first of all, perceiving and then concomitantly modeling time and control. And that's the eternalism model of time and control. So that means that the past is still fixed. So eternalism and possibilism share the point of view that the past up to the present is monocausal, but they differ in that eternalism says that there's only one possible future. There's only one actual future, I should say. There are no alternative possible futures. And the way that I like to understand that to myself is, it sounds quite Christian, but it's like when you get to the end of time, or when you get to the end of your life, there's no more life ahead of you. All you have is memory. And possibilism has already established that memory only refers to a single course of events. So when there's no more future, then by default, you have to say that the whole thing was always monocausal, and that the possibility branching was only ever, it looks like from that point of view, that it was only ever illusory, or the time was never really branching. So a common thought that can occur to a person when they're tripping intensely, I don't want to emphasize that too much and say tripping really hard, really, really hard. They're in the intense state of psychedelic cognition that there was never any real option of life leading to this event, that my life was always inevitably leading me to the point where I would take drugs and then die afterwards, or experience the end of time, the end of sanity, the end of the world, the end of ordinary life, that kind of thing. So the ego death theory in that way explains why this feeling can occur to people when they're tripping hard, that that time has somehow ended, or life has ended, and that phenomenon is colloquially referred to as ego death, hence the ego death theory. So I think that's my neatest way of summarizing what the ego death theory says. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, what is the Trying to think of places to start. That's a really rich description. Places to go in. I guess some questions we could ask to further expand here is, what is what's it like for the mind to switch from this tight cognition to loose cognition, from tight cognitive binding to loose cognitive binding? What are those two states like for the mind? What is tight binding? What is it when I'm experiencing tight binding? What am I experiencing as opposed to what am I experiencing when I have loose binding?
Right. Okay. So I think there's going to be two different ways of explaining this. There's the way that is just cognitive modeling, and then there's the way that makes reference to familiar experiences that we have. So in terms of cognitive modeling, it's...
Well, actually, if I might jump in here before we get into the details, that distinction that you just made strikes me as an important move that the ego-death theory makes. The ego-death theory is concerned with providing a non-metaphorical, so to speak, or non-poetic, or a relatively non-metaphorical and relatively non-poetic, relatively precise, to speak positively, explanation of these phenomena. That's part of, I guess, one of the guiding principles of the ego-death theory development, is that all past attempts to describe this have floundered or run aground on too much metaphor, kind of hazy, not very precise, not very clear. And so that distinction that you just made between trying to use precise language, I suppose, cognitive modeling, and then more familiar I suppose metaphorical terms. I think that's an important part of the, when we talk about what is the ego-death theory, it's a way of thinking that is focused on, also trying to focus on getting the most precise use of words.
Yes.
To describe these two states.
So, I think it can be difficult to make the connection between the cognitive modeling and the familiar experience. So maybe that's why traditionally metaphor has been implied. That's something that I've struggled with, is understanding the full mapping of the psychedelic phenomenology to the cognitive modeling. Because, so you asked, what's it like to shift from the two states? And I guess, so I'll start in terms of familiar experiencing. When you're in the ordinary state of consciousness, the solid external reality seems solid. It has the appearance of being solid. And then you take the drugs and the state of consciousness changes, and then that solidity is markedly less.
Would you agree that we are in the tight cognition? Could we say that we are immersed in the mental constructs, or are immersed in the mental representations of reality? And then when we take the cognitive loosener, we perceive those mental constructs or those representations of reality, become aware of them, and so it's maybe a feeling of like stepping back or being elevated away from, some sort of distance from those representations, such that we can perceive the representations themselves.
Yes. Perceive the representations themselves, but perceive them as representations.
Gotcha. Yes.
Whereas in the ordinary states, they are so consistent, and I don't know what the most perfect word is. There's words that describe this quality that representations have in the ordinary state. So consistent and solid and reliable, words to that effect. So the representational appearance of the world appears so consistent, so solid, and so reliable that that the mind doesn't make the distinction between the representation and the thing that it represents. In fact, it conflates those two things. It treats them as if there is just one thing. And so it looks like perception is directly in contact with an external objective thing. So direct perception. So that, in philosophy, they call that naive realism, that the view that the world as it appears is the world that actually exists. So the mind doesn't... So this is a crucial application of the word tight, because there are two things here. You've got the mental representation, and then you've got the external thing that the representation purports to represent. And so those are two different things, but in the ordinary state of consciousness, those two things are tightly connected to each other. They're fused together, like they're indistinguishable from each other. That distinction just isn't apparent. That distinction in the ordinary state of consciousness is purely a speculation of armchair philosophizing and nothing more in the ordinary state.
I'm glad you said that, yes. Yes, so in the loose cognition rather forcibly makes the mind perceive that distinction and be aware of it in a way that the armchair speculation of ordinary state philosophy can only, well, speculate at.
Yes. I think there's an interesting... The way that armchair philosophy and what we know in the world as academic philosophy and socially sanctioned philosophy, they talk about philosophical problems. And the word problem is very interesting in that context, because when you're sitting in an armchair in the ordinary state doing philosophizing, these issues like what is the distinction between the representation and the actual world, they're problems, but they're not very serious problems. They're quite light-hearted problems that philosophers can just spend all day idly debating about. But then in the intense psychedelic state, the same philosophical problems emerge and arise, but now they're much more problematic. They can become very seriously problematic. And that's the core phenomenon that the ego death theory is focusing on, is the problematization of these issues. In particular, it's talking about the problematization of personal control. But if you think of...
So how do we get to that from the loose cognitive binding state? I mean, it sounds like there's one way of... Well, it sounds like loose cognitive binding can apply to something as simple as, well, for example, when people trip, they often report that their perceptions of things seem to blend or smear or swirl, or there's an unusual movement of light and color and audio effects and things like that. How do we get from there? That sounds like a looseness, but how do we get from there to a problemization of personal self-control? That sounds like a higher level concept,
right,
than just perception.
Right, yeah, so I suppose the perception aspect is, it's the very definition of superficiality. It's surface level. It's not very deep. We're talking about what the psychedelic drugs do on the absolute surface, what they do to the surfaces of objects, and they make the sounds sound warbly and distorted, and they make the surfaces of objects look like maybe the surface of a liquid, or it can undulate and flow. So that's a low-level perceptual phenomenon in terms of what we're talking about, but at the same time, it's an introductory level into the deeper part of it.
But it can point to the problem of the change from our accustomed solidity, right? The perceptual undulation can point upwards, I suppose, to use a spatial metaphor, can point to that higher level concept of the problem of control over our thoughts and over those mental constructs, right? Over that representation.
Right. So the early insight that a psychedelic explorer is likely to come across is that the way that, in the ordinary state of consciousness, the way that the mind conflates the representation with the thing that it represents, that assumes that the perception of an external object is truly external to the mind. It's something that exists out there in the objective world. But then it becomes apparent that when we are tripping and we're in a world of solid objects that are looking less solid, they also look less external and less objective. So the world that was previously taken for granted to be an external thing, an external object, now starts to look like it's mentally generated. So people talk about, people will say things like, the world seemed like a cartoon, where a cartoon is an artificial image of something rather than a real thing. So the initial problem is the problem of the conflation of the representation and the referent. That act of mental conflation becomes problematized, and so the connection of association between the representation and the real world is loosened. It comes apart to some extent. So this kind of analysis, you could call this metaperception analysis. You're describing a point of view that the mind and the perceptual apparatus is shifted into during the course of the psychedelic experience. But you can use the same analysis to, instead of looking outwards at the external world, you can turn that round 180 degrees and look inside yourself. And then you can make a very similar comparison between the ordinary state and the psychedelic state. But this is where the ego-death theory type dynamics come in, because what we're asking is, instead of saying, in the ordinary state of consciousness, how do you perceive the external world? Answer, you perceive it as if it were a solid and external and mind-independent. You're now saying, so in the ordinary state, when you look within, what do you see? What do you perceive? How do you perceive yourself? What do you perceive yourself to be? And Michael Hoffman answers that question very forcefully. He's saying that when you look within, when you turn your perception inwards 180 degrees in the ordinary state, what you perceive is a cybernetic homunculus, right? As if your truest identity, the thing that you are most fundamentally and most centrally, is a control agent. So you can think of yourself as being other things too. You can think of yourself, for example, as being a physical body inhabiting physical space, or you can think of yourself as being a sense of self. And that's something that the pop psych audience is very keen on saying, is that it's a sense of being a person without reference to control at that point. It's that comes later. It's a sense of self just means a thing with a name, and the name follows the thing around with it. The thing remains the same from one day to the next, from 1 minute to the next. So you have a broad different range of things that you can, ways that you can characterize what your self is, but there are certain core characteristics, like it's stable and persistent, very much like what we were saying about external objects. It has that same solid, concrete type of characteristic, that I have a very solid and concrete sense that I am a single person in a world, and that my identity persists across time. So that's the ordinary state-based way of characterizing my inner life, myself. And then,
well, if I could jump in here, there's Michael Hoffman has focused too on how we so often conceive of that self as the self that makes decisions, that moves around and has thoughts and decides what to think and decides what to do, such that seems totally natural and normal to us, and that our self is like the I, so to speak, or our self is the person who the thing or whatever in our head that has those thoughts, that makes those decisions, and that the loose cognition state also pulls us away from that, shows that those thoughts are, that sense, that construct of being a self who makes decisions is itself a construct. It's becoming aware of that construction, or that set of ideas. It's not perhaps a phenomenological or perception-oriented separation of representation and referent, but there's perhaps an analogy between the perceptions and that sense of being a agent who makes decisions. So perhaps we can speak of a connection there between or movement there from the perceptual realm to this sense of stepping back from being being immersed in making decisions.
Right. So yeah, normally decision-making just happens without any kind of... you don't really need to think about it. It's just a taken-for-granted configuration of the way that you are in the ordinary state as you're a decision-maker. That reminds me, there's a line in one of the songs by Rush, which Michael Hoffman has talked about, where he says, even if I decide not to decide, I've still made a choice, I think he says. So it's kind of saying that you can't escape from being a decision maker in the ordinary state of consciousness, because no matter what you do, you could be said to be choosing to do that thing as opposed to doing something else. So it's an absolutely basic configuration of the self is decision making.
Right. Not to derail us into talking about Rush, but that's a very funny line, in that the singer sings one line. I think it's, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. But the original lyric sheet printed, if you choose not to decide, you cannot have made a choice. And so there's a strange confusion between the song and the original lyric sheet. And I believe that was even addressed by the lyricist at one point, who said that, well, those are the words I wrote, or something. I can't control what was printed. I don't remember precisely what it is, but it's a funny moment that perhaps speaks more, I don't know, speaks to Rush's interest in double meanings and the whole topic of being a control agent. I think that more recent lyric sheets and lyrics that you find, for example, if you search for the song Free Will on the internet, you'll find only printed what the singer sings. But the original lyric sheets don't have that. They have a different, for such a crucial line, they have a different wording of it that seems to point to the opposite. So anyway, not to derail us into Rush trivia. This is not a Rush trivia podcast.
No, it's not.
Even though I know plenty of trivia about them. But anyway, returning to mental construct processing.
So in the tight default ordinary state of consciousness, there is this totally taken for granted background impression or configuration that what I am as an ego, as a self, a person, is a decision maker. But it's really important to point out that That's no small claim. That, sure, in one sense, that just means that in a very small way, I can make small decisions about my life. Like, if I'm thirsty, I can decide to go and get a drink and that kind of thing. That's just small rational actions on the part of a tiny body living in a massive universe. But on the other hand, that power of ego to make decisions has a truly cosmic scale when you think about it in the context of possibilism as a model of time as well as a model of control. Because what you're saying is that every time you make an individual decision as an ego, you're actually creating an entire universe, or you are steering into an entire universe at to the exclusion of an infinitude of alternative possible universes. It's not just your small life that is affected by your egoic choices. It's actually the entire world, because you can think of you're steering into the world where your ego made a particular decision, as opposed to just simply making that decision. It sets the stage of what the whole world is. So it's a universe-wide ability to be able to make decisions like that, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like a very small thing that you do in this tiny, localized bit of space that you inhabit. That's how it feels in the ordinary state. Then if you're tripping sufficiently hard, you become aware of the cosmic dimension to that decision-making ability.
And so that sense of the cosmic, or the sense of creating possible worlds via making those choices, that's something that can't survive the loose cognitive state, or the altered state initiation, so to speak. So that whole idea is one that is, or set of philosophical theories. I've heard of possible world theories. I haven't studied them in much detail, but I've heard that term thrown around, possible worlds theory or something like that. But that is a completely ordinary state-based theory.
Yes, it is.
It can't survive. It can't happen in the altered state, the loose cognitive state. Or it can't survive it, the kind of acid wash bath.
Right.
Go ahead.
It's I think many worlds theory, that's something to do with quantum physics. It's the idea that there's two different interpretations of quantum physics, which is the Einstein interpretation and then they call it the Copenhagen interpretation, but I think it's associated with one particular scientist. I think the name is Bohm or Bohr, B-O-H-M or B-O-H-R, said many worlds theory. And Michael Hoffman's criticism of that is that you postulate many worlds in order to try to protect and preserve egoic decision-making, because the alternative is the Einstein interpretation of quantum physics, which is pure, hard, iron block determinism. So Einstein was on Michael Hoffman's side in that debate. Like, Einstein is more like an ego death theorist. Einstein is not. He said, God does not play dice, meaning there's not multiple outcomes. When you flip a coin, it's not that there's a 50-50 chance of it landing on any particular side. It's more like there's a percentage of 100% that it lands on one side and 0% that it lands on the other side. So it's two different ways of understanding what probability is all about, what it involves.
I see. It's been some time since I looked into those debates in physics, in the field of physics. Somebody with a background in that can fact check us on it. As I recall, there are two people, last name Bohr, one of them, and last name Baum, and I recall they're on opposite sides of this debate. So somebody, somebody with a background can fact check this podcast on that. But
to be on the safe side, it's called the Copenhagen Interpretation, and that comes from a particular conference which occurred in Copenhagen in the days when these issues were being actively and presently discussed. And at the Copenhagen Interpretation, they outlined, as far as I understand it, this many worlds idea, which seems to protect the integrity of egoic decision making, whereas Einstein was not concerned with that.
Each new decision creates a new world along the different branching pathways. Yeah.
So, I mean, everything we've said so far, that's very much concerned with the ordinary state, perception and modeling of egoic decision-making. But then, as you said, that whole set of assumptions and beliefs doesn't survive the acid wash. The acid wash spells doom. It's not just that the altered state spells doom for egoic decision-making. It's more like psychedelic initiation. You have to go through this process of initiation to get the full the full brainwashing effect of it, where the mental world model is permanently reconfigured to incorporate the new point of view. But let's spell out what that new point of view is. So you've got this meta-perception level when you're tripping intensely, where nothing quite seems solid like it used to, and egoic decision making doesn't seem solid like it did before, and the outcome of that, it's like a process of thinking that leads on from the observation that what was once perceived as a solid, stable, and consistent sense of self, which is to say a causally efficacious ability to make decisions and steer between possibilities, that starts to look like undulating and wavy and mentally generated, as opposed to being solid and external and real. And that leads to the thought of determinism, that the thought that there is no decision making and that time only goes in one way, and that nexus of causation, which started at the beginning of time and carries on to this day, is actually just leading inexorably in one way, and there's no possibility of moving off of the fixed course of events. So I'm reminded of a limerick which occurs in, I think, one of Alan Watts' books, something like, I forget the whole limerick, but it said, I move in determinate grooves, I'm not really a bus, I'm a tram, as in saying that your life is on a set of rails, and the rails control the direction of your forward movement. They don't branch. You have no alternative route to go on. You just have to follow the rail of your life going forward. So that is this great, powerful, amazing, permanently mind-changing experience, which is called ego death. And it's very unfortunate that the pop psych world and the pop spiritualist world has distorted the term ego death to the point of absurdity. It's basically impossible to ascertain an accurate, meaningful definition of what ego death is from any of the published literature. It just doesn't exist. You won't read anywhere in any work of published literature which refers to ego death, and there are many such books, but you won't see in any of them that it's the feeling of dying or discovering fatedness or reaching the end of time, anything like that. They stick to this vague, wishy-washy language of your sense of self is dissolved and things like that. I mean, the name Martin Ball is really flashing in my head right now as I say this. Like, he's a major source of this kind of confusion about what ego death is. I mean, first of all, they're hesitant to use the word death, and they try to fudge that and muddle over that and call it ego loss, whereas Michael Hoffman was very adamant that the correct word is death, and that's so ultimately prominent in his writing because he calls his theory the ego death theory, and he calls his website egodeath.com. You know, he took that URL for a reason, and he stuck with it. So death is a powerful word, and it's rightly so. It's correct and appropriate to use such a powerful word to describe this experience because it does actually feel like death. And this is something, I think, Strange Loop, it's important to kind of refer to Strange Loop here, because in terms of his own psychedelic experiencing, I get the sense that he really wants to have that experience. He knows that it's unpleasant. He knows that it's bad, but he has a strong motivation to have it. So he's really doing some quite hardcore psychonautic exploring, and he's got some good hookups with research chemicals to do that. Because that's something that I've struggled with. It doesn't seem, as far as I can tell, that ego death experience is inevitable from just taking psychedelics. It seems to demand something a bit more than that, and it's certainly possible to take psychedelics many, many times and experience many psychedelic trip experiences, but never have the this extreme experience that we're talking about. And let's be under no illusion about how extreme it is. I think that's one of the central motivations of the ego death theory, and Michael Hoffman does say that. He says something like, this is the most profound and intense experience that the mind can undergo, and it leaves a permanent effect on the way that thinking is organized going forth from then for the rest of life. You can't forget ego death. It permanently changes the way that you understand yourself and the world.
Well, to continue on the slight, I guess, meta or discourse level, I do think that there's an important, I think partly why our project is so valuable in deconstructing those pop psych narratives is that I get the sense that people who may have experienced something like the ego death experience described the way that Michael Hoffman has described it in the ego death theory, they don't necessarily have the vocabulary, or they don't like the vocabulary of death. I mean, you pointed out people trying to shy away from using that term. And so I think that there are people who have experienced full, intense, extreme ego death, but don't like to talk about it that way. They want to conceive of it as something not a death. There's lots of especially in the kind of the official narratives about psychedelics coming out of therapists and universities and funding agencies. There's a lot of advertising. It's got to be a nice positive experience for everybody to have. It's you can see that in a lot of the material. I think our work deconstructing that, listening to James Kent's podcasts, the Final 10 series on the dark side, he was very keen to point out the amount of positive marketing spin that goes into talking about psychedelics these days. So I think that coming back around to what you brought up, I think it's hard to know, because we're trying to champion a way of talking that's much more no nonsense and not connected to any we're not trying to sell anyone anything about taking psychedelics to have a nice pleasant time. We're after describing what goes on in that state when you want to mess around with ego death. It's not necessarily pleasant. So to come, I guess, to finish off my thought again, restate it, I think that we can speculate that there are more people who have experienced that, but they do not want to talk about it that way, or they go in expecting to have just a nice pleasant experience, and they're kind of primed to just talk about it that way and only focus on that part of it and shy away from, I think you mentioned Martin Ball, for example, and he's a good example of a lot of his discourse about psychedelics tries to shy away from what he calls the shadow side of things. Even James Kent, who wants to point out the positive, happy marketing of psychedelics, the whole aim of that Final 10 project was to highlight the dark side in order to have people protect themselves from having a dark, depressing, or not depressing necessarily, but a dark experience with psychedelics.
Despite the fact that it was precisely a dark, horrible, depressing experience which James Kent had, which led him to embark on his entire psychedelic career. So I sense a contradiction there. So you mentioned that there are people who will have had this difficult, unpleasant experience, but then are reticent to talk about it in those terms because they sense the taboo and they don't want to discredit psychedelia, so they focus on the positive side. I also think that there may be people who haven't experienced this phenomenon that we're talking about, but they want to say they have, or they want to think they have. So they'll talk about ego death to refer to things that are not really ego death, to refer to the lighter, happier side of psychedelic experiencing, which obviously there is certainly a huge amount of. Like psychedelic experiencing is much more typically something very positive and enriching and psychotherapeutic and that kind of thing. So there's two sides to that coin.
Sure. That's true. I think there's maybe, to bring in the term of no separate self, that's a term that's thrown around a lot. That kind of pleasant feeling of blending into the environment, so to speak, or representations. That can be very pleasant feeling as people report. And I think that I often detect that that's what people are referring to when they try to use the much more serious term ego death.
Yeah.
They're often, these kind of pop psych narratives and people talking about that. I agree. People haven't experienced ego death, but it's a tricky term. There's a certain cultural cachet around it as well. People praise ego death as something that's good for people. Some people want to have it, or what they think it is.
Yeah. I'm slightly conscious of this conversation becoming a bit of a rant about pop psych and pop spirituality. But on the other hand, I think that maybe we kind of have to do that. And it's certainly really tempting. But to make this point, we do need to contrast the vision put forward by Michael Hoffman's ego death theory compared to the confused mess of contradictions that the pop psych and pop spirituality worlds are trying to project.
Right. Anyone who listens to us will know our thoughts on that. So maybe, not to interrupt, you can keep going in a moment, but another question or topic in my mind is can we talk about time slices? What's that about and what's that like? We've talked about the rail of the past moving into the future as being revealed as just being more like a single path that one moves along, rather than a set of branching roads. But what's the vertical? That's a horizontal metaphor. What's this vertical metaphor of time slices, and what is that like? That strikes me as important.
Sure. I just wanted to say one thing to finish off what we were talking about before. I wanted to use the expression elephant in the room. That's, I think, the true position that ego death experiencing has in the world of pop spirituality and pop psychedelia. It's a hot potato and they don't really know how to handle it, and they kind of want to deny it, but they also kind of want to praise it, and they don't want to squarely acknowledge that ego death is a bad trip and an unpleasant experience and involves psychosis and psychotic thinking. That would be too discrediting. And I also wanted to just bring in the example of Jimmy, because I think Jimmy very clearly fits into the mold that you said there, where you said that people have the bad trip experience and ego death, but then they don't want to talk about the bad side of it. I don't think Jimmy recognizes that the experience he had that the first time he ever tripped is essentially ego death and the ultimate mystical experience. He wants to try to bring in all these spiritualist writers who talk about nothing but blissful peace and love, light, and that kind of thing, and then he doesn't integrate the sheer importance of his own bad trip experience into that pop spiritualist narrative. But anyway, moving on from that. So you mentioned time slices. So yeah, this is a different way of modeling time again. And I think, as is so often the case when we're talking about this, cognitive modeling is kind of complex and kind of difficult to really see the true picture of, in terms of how it relates to the perceptual phenomena, the experiential phenomena. So instead, it's better to use analogy to illustrate what we're talking about. And I already mentioned this idea that what you will commonly see in people's trip reports, where they describe their psychedelic experiences, that they might say something like, the world seemed like a cartoon. And then cartoon, by definition, is not real, not external, not solid, and it's more like a mentally projected, where the cartoonist is your mind. But another interesting way of analyzing the concept of a cartoon fits into the time slice analysis, because if you think about what a cartoon consists of, it's a series of still frames that are played very quickly in sequence to create the illusion of movement. So you have one frame, which is one solid still image, and then another image next to that first image, which is just ever so slightly different. And then another image, which is, again, ever so slightly different. So stop motion animation is another obvious use of this kind of idea, that if you or a flip book, where you draw a picture in the corner of a book and then you draw another picture on the next page that's slightly different from the first one, and then keep doing that, then if you flick through the book, you can create the illusion of movement and continuous identity as well, sameness across time, which is exactly what a cartoon is. There's no real movement in a cartoon, because movement would imply, and I suppose you could say, an infinite number of slices rather than a finite number of slices. But if you play them quick enough, and if the difference between one still frame and the next still frame is sufficiently small that when they're played quickly, the mind can't see the jump between the two, that you get the illusion of fluid movement. So to say time slices implies that each individual slice is frozen solid, in the same way that a still image that makes up one frame of a cartoon reel is a frozen still image. And that frozenness is precisely the outcome, or the inevitable conclusion of the eternalist way of modeling time, that there's no movement, there's no way of changing the possibility course, there's just one solid way that things can go. Another possible analogy there is a book. I think a book is such a wonderful, as in a work of fiction, a storybook is a wonderful analogy for the eternalism model of time, because you've got a series of pages, and each page is analogically similar to a solid frame in a cartoon reel. But then if you take the whole book, then you've got the full story of, say, like it might be a person's life is told in the storyline of the book. So from the external point of view, you can see the whole book exists all at once, all in one go. That's the block universe. But on the inside, if you're a character in the book and you've lived your life up to, say, page 30, then from your perception of things, from your point of view, it's more like the ordinary state thing of flowing life. So time slices are analogically comparable to frames in a cartoon or pages in a book. So do you think I've said enough to fully outline that?
So do we experience, to bring it to the realm of our, I guess, experiencing or phenomenological experiencing, that in the loose cognitive state, our mental representation of time and the passing of time also splits. And I guess what I'm trying to articulate is the relation between the loosening of cognitive associations and cognitive binding and of perceptions with the sense of time as a the sense of time becoming broken down as well, reaching the end of time.
Yes. So it's a different way of perceiving time. Loose cognition gives us a different way of perceiving in general, but then more specifically, and moving towards the specific theory domain of the ego death theory, it's about a different way of perceiving time. And that, because what I said at the beginning, that the way the mind models the world seems like you could say something like the mind models time and control at the same time, or the mind's model of control and the mind's model of time are inextricably linked with each other. So what you're saying here is, in loose cognition, you've got this different way of perceiving time, and the time slice concept fits in with that different way of perceiving time, which is eternalism. So it's like you're perceiving time as if it was a solid book that's already been written, or a cartoon, but instead of watching the cartoon and seeing it beginning to end, you can just see the whole reel, or say the video cassette that it's on, or DVD or whatever that it's on. It actually reminds me of, in my very early days of psychedelic exploration, like the first few trips I had, when I was totally naive to all of this theorizing and talk of history of psychedelic use and all this kind of thing. I was just a young, naive person experimenting with drugs, basically, well, for fun and for exploration. I can remember very clearly that I got quite excited about looking in a mirror when I'm tripping hard. And I can remember so clearly that what that looks like, I had the experience reproducibly multiple times. There's not very much that is reproducible and controllable about psychedelic experiencing, but this was a remarkably familiar experience, which I experimented with over multiple different psychedelic experiences with different substances as well, mushrooms and LSD, is that looking in a mirror, instead of just seeing this solid face that I'm so used to seeing, like my own face, suddenly, if I stare at my reflection in a mirror, it looks like I'm being presented with a very rapid cycling of different faces, like 1,000 different faces. And this is one reason why I made a point of reading Joseph Campbell's book, because it's called the 100 Faces of the Hero or something like that. And I thought, that resonated with my tripping experience. I thought there must be something relevant about this book, because that title just sounds so relevant, this 1,000 faces. And that, at the time, I had no conceptual framework to fit it into. But then later on down the line, a couple of years later, when I learned the ego death theory and I learned about time slices, I thought, oh yes, that makes so much sense, of that particular phenomenon that I encountered in those early psychedelic sessions of seeing a fluttering of different individual faces instead of the same continuous face that I'm used to when I look in a mirror. So yeah, time slices. It's the same concept. It's like you learn this theoretical, this whole theory, and then you can then look at trip reports, and you can see isolated elements of trip reports that fit into the theory, same as you can see isolated elements of mythological and religious stories that fit into the theory. So that was an important connection that I made, which for me, it validated the theory, and it also taught me this technique of interpreting trip reports and also religious and mythological stories in terms of the ego death theory. So yeah, time slices is a way of conceptualizing what eternalism means for how time is structured. So did you have anything to add to that?
And so it's a way of trying to, the term time slice is a way of capturing or modeling what it's like, what the experience of time is like in the altered state as a series of moments, the sense of a flow of time that is characteristic of the ordinary state is changed to a set of a series of moments with changes between those moments simply or each moment is arranged into a different position, but not with any flow between them. And it's that thought, just to finish my thought, it's that thought of that, I guess it's that's a key step in leading towards the killing of the ego, because the ego, you have to make the connection that one is normally expecting to be able to oneself alter the arrangement in each time slice. One normally conceives of one's decision making as altering the next time slice or some future time slice, but in fact one doesn't have the opportunity to do that. One sense of movement and thoughts are kept out of doing that. The changes simply happen. So the time slice is like a key, or the combination of time slice with the ego, quote unquote, or the sense of being an agent making decisions. That's the killing stroke on the ego. Do you agree?
Yes, I guess what you're saying, the killing stroke is when you connect that concept of time slices up to the concept of control, because one time slice can't control the next one. And the situation that you get when it becomes really dramatic in ego death experiencing is that one time slice tries to control the next one and becomes increasingly anxious about exerting that control across time and finding out that it's not able to.
So perhaps it's not the killing stroke, but it sets off a chain reaction, something like that.
Yes.
The ego tries to, that control system tries to apply itself to changing time slices and finds that it can't.
Yeah. So, I mean, I suppose to complete the picture with time slices, you have to specify if it appears as time slices in the altered state, what is the corresponding appearance of time in the ordinary state? If it's not slices, then what is it? Just a continuous line, as opposed to a line that is divided up into slices. So in the ordinary state, it doesn't feel like time is a series of individual isolated moments. It feels like there's an absolute continuity between them. So it's the difference between discreteness and continuity, that the time slices are discrete, and that discretion implies a lack of control, an inability to control the next one. So it's another way of putting it that I recall from Michael Hoffman is talking of statues, that I found enlightening when I first came across that it's like, again, the same thing as stop motion animation. You have a series of statues that are very subtly different from each other in the way that an animation is, and those statues are lined up along the time axis. And they are entirely independent from each other. And the point of view that swings into the mind during intense psychedelic cognition is being isolated in your time slice. So But it's like that all the time anyway, and this is something that the self-help guru Eckhart Tolle really capitalized on in pointing out that even in the ordinary state, you're always just in the present, and you can never go backwards or forwards, really. The way Eckhart Tolle puts it is that the present moment is the only thing that's actually real, which is the philosophy of presentism. But that's not what the ego death theory is saying. It doesn't say that the past and future are not real, but just that the cybernetic continuity between the past, present, and future time slices is unreal, and that there is actually no way of controlling your future self in the same way that your past self doesn't control you. You can do something in the present that is completely independent of what you wanted to do 5 minutes ago, and then following from that, your future self can do something which is completely independent of you, and to add to that, completely unwanted. So, and I suppose what we need to talk about here is your overall set of intentions. So, in general, the way that the human being is hardwired, and this harks to the philosophy of Schopenhauer, which I would like to maybe cover at some point in a podcast, because he really spelled this out. Schopenhauer said that the fundamental property of everything, every real thing, every object, is to carry on existing. And he said that everything from a stone on the beach to a human being has that fundamental will to carry on existing. And human beings are no different. It's why human beings instinctively avoid death. So if you're in the ordinary state and suddenly you're faced with a mortal danger, something like someone holds a gun to your head, or a lion walks into the room looking really hungry, your instinct is going to be mortal panic and fear and a desperation to protect your life. So you will hand over your money to the person who is holding a gun to your head. You know, it's a typical thing, that a cliche that robbers will say to you: your money or your life, because the robber knows that if you're faced with that decision, you're going to pick your life, because that's the most fundamental thing that you have, and you desire to continue it, to maintain it. Now, that is sharply contrasted with the situation that you find yourself in intense psychedelic experiencing, when it turns nasty and it turns psychotic and unwanted, when it turns unrecreational and it ceases to be about having fun. You start to worry about what your future self might do, and you start to project motivations onto your future self, such as the thought that you're about to try to commit suicide. And that's something that I was very struck by when I gave my trip report of the big massive freakout experience that I had, and then Jimmy described his. He said that exact same thing, that it was about wanting to commit suicide and wanting to try to clear the drugs out of his system. He said he was asking his brother to try to induce vomiting in him to get the drugs out of him. And that's exactly, I had the same thought when I was going through that experience, that if I could only make myself vomit, I would be able to get my control back. So normally it would be completely unthinkable to think that you suddenly might want to commit suicide in 5 minutes, and that there's no way that you can control your future self to stop them from doing that, to preserve your life according to this basic fundamental will to carry on existing. But then when you're tripping, suddenly, unexpectedly, that possibility swings into view in a truly horrifying way, that actually you might kill yourself in a few minutes, and that there's nothing you can do to stop your future self from doing that, because you are cybernetically independent of your future self. So it's the cybernetic independence is something that characterizes the altered state, whereas the ordinary state is more like cybernetic dependence, and your actions flow smoothly from each other, continuously with each other as time progresses. That feeling breaks down in the altered state, which leads to panic.
Okay, so panic, fear of your own near future action, possibly ending your own existence because you can't, that thought appears in your head because you can't stop yourself in the future. You don't know. So there's increasing panic.
And the increase just gets more and more, and then Michael Hoffman has characterized that as like a tightening noose. If you have a noose around your neck and you're dangling, you might instinctively try to struggle to get out of it, but that's not rational, because by struggling when you've got a noose around your neck, you're only making your problem worse because you're making the noose get tighter. So it's that kind of a dynamic where anything that you do to try to get out of the situation ends up making the situation worse.
Right, and so that's our that's our moment, we could say, when the mind's kind of savior potential kicks in, or rescuing potential, or transformation potential, to move away from metaphors with rescue and savior. But the only way out of that is to switch your sense of that, get rid of that control agency, or qualify your initial thoughts about your own agency over your own thoughts, leading people to model some sort of, and come up with, or model, maybe not come up with, but realize some sort of hidden control source is the technical term we often use. Some sort of source of thoughts that is not coming from oneself, one's local sense, or that initial sense of control. And that had been, that whatever that other source is, had always been in control of your thoughts and always been steering you, thus leading to a sense of a dependent control. Whatever sense of control you have is dependent on that other source, because it can't be you. You've seen in the altered state that it can't be that initial source that was predicated upon an open future and control across time.
Except that only leads to, in a sense, to a further problem, because if you are just relying on your personal egoic domain of control, at least you know that the thought of killing yourself or going insane is a bad thing, something to be avoided. But if you're then pushed into a position where you have to postulate higher control to rescue you from this dire situation you're in, the higher control has to be compassionate. But it might not be. The universe might just want you to dissolve at this particular moment in time. It's one thing that you have to postulate higher control, something that was in charge all along, the whole time, but it has to be beneficial. It has to care about you enough to care about your worrying about your future integrity, but it might not. So there's always the risk, because this higher control is not human. I think that's a really important point about this higher control source, this controller X that has to be postulated in this desperate situation, is that it's not just another person like you. It's not like you're talking to a personal friend or a parent or something. What that ultimate control source is actually utterly alien and mysterious.
It's not directly accessible to you.
Yes, it's like
to your local source.
In some of the Christian artworks, they just depict a hand coming out of a cloud, and you only see the hand. You don't see the rest of the body, so you don't know what the motivation behind that control is. You only know that your own motivation is to preserve your own life. in the Schopenhauerian sense. There's another great German thinker called Friedrich Schleiermacher, and he was a German theologian, and he characterized the relation between God and the individual as the other way around, the individual and God as a relation of helpless dependence. That the egoic control, the personal self is helplessly dependent on on the higher self and what it wants to do. So it's So prayer is an important point here. It's not just merely postulating higher control that rescues you. It's praying with an attitude of, like Schleiermacher said, helpless dependence. You have to acknowledge your dependence on that higher control to rescue you, knowing that you have no personal control, that the higher control is the one that is holding all of the cards and has all of the power in that situation. So it's a self-supplication. It's admitting to yourself and to God that you are nothing and you have no control. So please rescue me, whatever it is that does have control.
With the result being the hoped for result being a 2-level model of control. Once one has repudiated or given up or acknowledged one's helpless dependence, total dependence on that hidden source.
But there's something here
Go ahead.
I'm not sure if this is that I've always misunderstood the ego-death theory, or if there's something missing from my understanding of the ego-death theory, is how exactly is that supposed to happen? Because I think about my own experience. I got right to the end of that bad trip without... I don't think I ever postulated higher control while I was still tripping. That took quite a long time afterwards before I figured out about what God means in the context of a person having a bad trip. But at the time, I didn't have that. That was actually an important distinction between my experience of ego death, which I described in episode 2 of the podcast, and yours, which you described in episode 1, is that when you had your formative experience, you already knew about the ego death theory, and you said to yourself in the middle of the experience, no, I know about this. I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to pray. But I didn't have that. I didn't know about the ego death theory, so I just caved in to despair, and then I spent the entire trip cowering in terror. And then afterwards, I was traumatized. Even when I got back to the normal world, I was traumatized, and I had to do all this philosophical work of revising my assumptions. So something I'm not always clear about in the ego death theory is, when is that postulation of higher control supposed to happen? Does that happen when you're still tripping, or is that the transition out of the difficult loose cog experience back into tight cognition? That's always been a little bit unclear. Or maybe it's different for different people in terms of the shape of psychedelic initiation. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, what I described in episode 1, to speak to the timing, that happened while still in the midst of the loose cognition session. As you say, I was, and as I said back then in episode 1, I was primed for that, and I think I made use of the ego death theory as a guidebook or technology, so to speak, in what to do and how to do that. So I had to get through that experience, or how to deliberately postulate that.
And then
and follow through on that supplication, basically.
So what was that like? Like, how did the trip change when you made that particular mental move? Did it suddenly lighten, or how did it feel when you actually made that move, before, during, and afterwards?
I made that move, and the sense of being out of control and and fearful of what I would do in the future, as well as to some extent the feeling that I was, well, the feeling that my perceptions were overwhelming me. I mean, on a more superficial level, that I was being lost in almost like some sort of whirlpool of my own perceptions. That faded. So this maybe brings us to the timing of a loose cognition session, though. It's possible that that was happening towards the end of that. I wasn't timing it that way, but this is some years ago now. I do recall a change in after doing that supplication, that prayerful supplication and repudiation. I do recall the loose cognition experience changing a bit, and I think taking a more feeling as though I could relax a bit, that I could let myself, the feeling of struggle changed, and I could let myself be moved and observe the thoughts that came along, and less that I was struggling to have my say in them, so to speak. That sense of struggle went away.
Right. You made a really interesting point there. You said it was as if you were deliberately going through this thought process, and that made the trip feel less intense, and you could relax a bit. But you also said it might have just been that you were coming towards the end of the trip anyway. So you could almost maybe say that there are two ways of explaining it. That on the one hand, this whole process of postulating higher control and then praying to higher control for rescue is a deliberate process of thoughts, but on the other hand, it could just be something that your thinking is basically forced to do simply by the chemical metabolism of what's going on in the way the trip rises and falls as purely a neurochemical process.
Well, another bit of data for that is that this experience happened during a kind of regular series of loose cognition sessions that I was undergoing or putting myself through, and so I think it was about every week. It was a regular series, and subsequent sessions of a similar dosage of the cognitive loosener, So in those subsequent sessions, the bit of data I want to bring up is that I didn't experience the same sense of struggle at all, despite a similar intensity of, so to speak, really, really a lot of intensity. No, I don't know. Despite a similar dosage level of the cognitive loosener, I felt that there was something different about those subsequent sessions. The experience was not, I didn't have to go through that struggle in the same way, having gone through it to such an extent, and gone through the supplication. So that was a marked difference. I think that there was I felt a certain acceptance of the dependent control and dependent nature of thinking in the experience, in subsequent experiences. So that would persist throughout the entirety of it. Now, and then since then, anytime I've had been tripping, so to speak colloquially, I have not had the I've perhaps had to remind myself about the dynamics of prayer or supplication or repentance, so to speak, but nothing with the same intensity as that one time. It's almost like a familiar pattern or familiar move to make. So I don't know. I think I don't know what to say. I haven't thought that much about the point you've raised about it there being a possible connection between the timing of the trip session and the thoughts regarding the self-control cybernetics. It certainly seems to track on to a certain... One could imagine there being a track of, beginning to notice perceptual changes to then noticing one's sense of self becoming loosened, to then the issues with time and the thought that those provoke. Maybe this is imagining an ideal session in which one person goes from 0 to ego death in a single session, which might be a hypothetical scenario. I mean, we have talked about, or the ego death theory talks about a series of sessions.
And so a series of sessions, I guess there's an implication there that part of the process is also what happens between the sessions and the thinking and perhaps the reading that you do when you're in your downtime in preparation for the next one. Because you build on the thoughts and the understandings that you have over the course of multiple sessions.
Right. Which I ties into our point a little while ago about what kind of language we're using to talk about the loose cognition state and tripping and all of this. The pop psych crew have one way of doing it. We have a different way of doing it. But the language certainly matters. What you're studying before, during, and after matters.
Yeah. So and also there's a point here that there's two parallel processes which are kind of separate but also kind of intertwined, which is on the one hand you've got the chemical process of chemicals going through your system, through your brain, and causing certain perceptual effects which then stop and go back to normal. And parallel to that, you've got the process of your thinking and the development of your understanding as the chemicals are coming and going. So there's those two parallel processes, but the outcome is the same. The outcome is that you get a modified and enhanced mental world model, or you get the addition of a new mental world model, so that you now have two separate mental world models coexisting in the same mind. That's an enlightened mind. That's a mind that has successfully been through ego death and then integrated it and come out the other side and understood it and made peace with it, and is then, as Michael Hoffman has said, is then able to trip after that without fearing the total conflagration and transformation. That only happens once. That doesn't just keep happening. You can keep climaxing, have multiple ego death type experiences, but it doesn't keep on transforming your mind again and again. Once the basic transformation has happened, that then stays with you for the rest of your life.
Again, there's that interaction. I just want to agree with you about there's the two interacting fields, I suppose, of experience, and then our knowledge about the experience, or the way we conceive of the experience. And I often wonder about that with my own set of experiences. Have all happened in the context of knowing generally about the ego death theory. I became interested in psychedelics and cognitive looseners, and after reading about the claims made in the ego death theory about what they do and wanting to... I was relatively not familiar with psychedelics and their besides just general cultural awareness of them, but I was relatively not... I hadn't read anyone else writing about psychedelics. It's just those are things out in the world that, yes, drugs, okay, something vague, some sort of vague messaging about them, but so I guess it gets us to this tricky question of the extent of how our experiences are shaped by the discourse that we that we encounter and read, and to what extent they're not shaped by that, and that there's something of an intractable question there.
Yeah, this is bringing to mind a very important distinction that Ken Wilber made. He said states and stages, and in his model there was a very large number of states and a very large number of stages. But what Michael Hoffman's model does, it uses that same basic terminology of this distinction between states and stages, but instead of this zillion stage model of Ken Wilber, he's saying there are only two states and two stages, which is to say you're in the ordinary state and you're in the psychedelic state. Those are the two stages, and then you've got the stage where you are unaware of this whole thing, the whole enterprise of deterministic thinking and metaphor, and then you've got the subsequent stage where you are fully initiated and you have both world models and you understand how metaphor works. So it's the egoic stage and the transcendent stage follow on the heels of the ordinary state and the psychedelic altered state.
Right. Would I have had the same set of experiences if I had never heard of the ego-death theory? Well, I think the ego-death theory would say yes, because the ego-death theory claims to be describing what happens in the altered state. What's the typical movement, so to speak, in the altered state, in the loose cognition state, from between the two mental world models. But would I have been able to describe it that way, or would I have conceived of it that way during the transformation of those mental world models? Would I have made all the same moves that I did? That's perhaps these are all counterfactual questions that have no answer, because that's what did happen. So,
But do you think that maybe you can hasten the process by knowing about the ego-death theory? Because it kind of sounds like you might have done that in your experience.
I think so. Yes, I think so. I think that there's a... Well, I use that term I use the ego-death theory as a kind of guidebook to that phenomenology, that set of experiences and set of thoughts and philosophical problems, cognitive problems, call them philosophical if we want to, a loaded term. But so using it as a guidebook, and I think that this is now bringing us over towards what Michael Hoffman has called his phase 2 area, and I'm cognizant of time, and so we probably have to save that for later on, but the topic of metaphor and cultural initiation systems. And I think that probably in the past, or different cultural systems, one would have made use of that technology, so to speak, say Christianity or Buddhism or whatever form, whatever religion or cultural system, or, you know, even in the 20th century, something like rock clubs and rock music, whatever, or other raves, something like that. So I lost my train of thought. I use the ego-death theory as a guidebook. In the past, I suppose we'd say people used, or in other cultural systems, people use their cultural system as a guidebook. And part of the ego-death theory's relationship or stance on those other systems is that they're not... the ego-death theory also explains those other systems better than, or more clearly than, those systems themselves can explain themselves.
Because the other systems...
You use a lot of selves in that sentence.
Right,
Go ahead.
I was going to say the other systems are designed to accommodate the egoic state. They're not meant to enlighten the ego. They're meant to... They can actually keep the ego as it is. So in other words, you can have the egoic mental configuration and fully get Christianity on that level. Christianity works on the egoic level and it works on the transcendent level, whereas the ego-death theory doesn't work on the egoic level. It's just pushing towards enlightenment and transcendence.
Right, because its very topic is the transcendent level.
Because
it always pushes you in that direction. No, I see what you're saying. That's a nice way to put it.
And actually, this is making me wonder. So we're talking about how the ego-death theory contributed to your experience of psychedelic initiation, and then how the lack of the ego-death theory contributed to my experience of psychedelic initiation. It puzzles me, in light of this conversation, why exactly Strange Loop is reporting that he is struggling to attain the high experiences, because he's got the ego-death theory. He gets it. He knows about transcendent control and eternalism and that kind of thing, but he's taking drugs and pushing dosage and repeatedly immersing himself in loose cognition, but he's got this lingering frustration that he hasn't had the full hallowed experiences that we talk about, of extreme control loss. So I do wonder what's going on in his mind that's causing that kind of a dynamic. But I agree with you.
A topic for speculation.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with what you said before about pushing towards phase 2 and talking about phase 2, that given the timing of this podcast and everything, I think we should return to that, because that's a whole massive 50% of the theory, really, that we've hardly touched on in this first recording. So we should have a follow-up to this and move into the phase 2 side of the theory, which is metaphor, religion, mythology, and then spell that out.